In this presentation, we are going to appreciate the significance of the U.S. war with Mexico for the people of both the United States and Mexico. So this is United States war with Mexico, Part 2. Now, in Part 2, the importance of the war for the United States is significant. We still live with the consequences of this war, and that's important for us to understand. We're going to take a look at the importance of the war for the United States, the tragedy of the war for Mexico, and the impact of the war on peoples residing in the territories that the United States inherited. Okay, so when discussing this particular war, the United States historians deliberately distort the people's experiences and couch the war in sectional rivalry. The war is written as an extension of the debate over slavery versus free labor. There's no attempt, even by the most liberal of writers, to look at the war in terms of human rights and its consequences to the people on both sides of the border. Basically, the war is just part of an ordinary process of change, a process of expansion that's linked to two marketing systems, one marketing system going west, the other marketing system going north. And the war results in the California Compromise of 1850, and that's how it's written. But the war ensured that the United States would strategically become a major world power. The system becomes continental. The oceans become the borders. Natural resources, especially minerals and oil, are going to be at the nation's disposal. So it's very significant for the United States. The acquisition of the land is going to stimulate internal tensions that eventually would lead to the Civil War. The U.S. acquired a territory for its own economic interest that was vital. Now, the legitimacy of the United States holding this territory is still a question that continues to be raised by scholarship. Legitimacy, again, the U.S. in this process is going to acquire a people within it. The U.S. is going to acquire a people with a different sense of history, with a different culture, with a different traditions, with a different linguistic heritage. This population was growing at the time of the takeover. It is growing today. The U.S. became an aggressor nation, a dominating nation. Though you can lie to the school children, the politicians knew that the country was blemished. There were clear material consequences from the occupation. But in the political process is where the tensions increase in the area of foreign policy and human rights. The values and the attitudes that were contested can be seen argued to this day, especially surrounding the border. There was a pro-war opinion that is expressed in simple arguments. There are altruistic and good reasons for going to war with Mexico. People are induced to support the war because Mexico has to be set straight, since it is not honoring an American claim. Mexican diplomats did not behave properly towards American diplomats. Mexico mistreated its American citizens. Intellectually, the war would be good for Mexico because she could benefit from American rule. And morally, it is the manifest destiny of the United States to have this territory. The president is an agent of God. And the best argument, of course, is that Mexico attacked the United States on American soil. So the defense of the homeland, the defense for national security was the motive for the war. Now, there was anti-war sentiment, but it was not as appealing. But it did attract a following that historians to this day stifle in American textbooks. The anti-war group claimed that pro-war arguments were not true, not valid. The war was not a noble act, but an attempt by the South to expand its cotton production into Texas. And they accused President Polk of manipulating the facts and deviously increasing his fortunes and the fortunes of his party members. Western interests were influenced by land developers who wanted more and more real estate. The U.S. attacked Mexico, not the other way around. But there's many different causes to the war and opposition to it, and some slavery interests were pushing for the war. Other Southerners feared that the war would stop slavery. Others thought that it would increase slavery. Many just wanted their shares of Mexican land. Politicians representing the West, especially President Jackson and President and eventually James K. Polk, President Polk, they were committed to supporting the acquisition of more land because to them war was logical. It would satisfy Western politicians' promises to large landowners that more land could be secured. Commercial, banking, and trading interests from the Middle Atlantic and the Northeast wanted to expand as far as China, and they had their eyes set on California because California seemed to be an ideal spot to complete the continental system. The Clipper ship trade from New York had gone all the way around to Argentina. They were taking a look at the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and Panama as a means by which to shorten that route to California. So when we take a look at Manifest Destiny is particular to North Americans. This is Anglo-American nationalism, if you will, because the American sense of freedom and democracy impelled this ideology, which was first formulated by President Monroe in 1820 under a doctrine stating that the United States would not allow any foreign interference in the independence movements of Latin America. The United States was making the world safe for democracy. And this notion is important because when Texas falsely claims independence and then wishes to annex itself to the United States, it will give moral justification to something that is totally immoral. And President Polk was a person who reflected all of the forces just mentioned. He was the man for the South. He was the man for the West. He was the man for commerce. God was with Polk. However, his vision was broader than many of the forces because many wanted the big pie. He certainly brought on the war, and he was successful at that. But why not take over all of the Western Hemisphere? The annexationist fever engulfs Polk, and this vision will influence filibustering activities in Nicaragua and Sonora, Mexico, where people will go in and claim the countries on behalf of the United States. But there was this opposition to the war that is important. They were of two sorts. People who opposed the war on altruistic and humanitarian grounds, and people whose economic interests would be endangered. Now, the altruists were not many. They were characterized by the transcendentalist view. Most altruists were writers and intellectuals. They argued that materialism is wrong and that war smacked of greed. Some of the altruists went to jail protesting the war. The most famous of these protesters was Thoreau. He spent one day in jail, and when his grandmother, his grandmother bailed him out because she couldn't stand the idea of a Thoreau being incarcerated. Then there was William Lloyd Garrison, abolitionist. The abolitionists were very important to protest the war. Garrison was the most famous leader and writer who opposed the war. You can see both of their pictures. Garrison is to the upper left and Thoreau is to the right. The traditional Democrats, they opposed the war because it threatened American institutions and democracy. That is William Lloyd Garrison there. He actively wrote against the war. The war would corrupt politicians. War would also maximize the power of the president and his bureaucracy. Most importantly, the true democracy would be a thing of the past. And finally, the honest, straight politicians opposed the war to save America from corruption. John Quincy Adams will give his final speech opposing the war on the floor of Congress, where he would collapse and die extolling the virtues of an honest republic. And Abraham Lincoln likewise would go on record opposing the war. So there is an institution called the School of Life, and published on January 27, 2017, on YouTube, a clip emphasizing that Henry David Thoreau not only wrote on Walden Pond, but he is also responsible for a small pamphlet entitled Civil Disobedience, which recommends that when a U.S. president is taking a wrong turn, good citizens have a duty to protest. Let's listen and understand the importance of American opposition to the U.S. war with Mexico, because it relates to us today. today.
In March 1845, the United States acquired a new president, James K. Polk, a forceful, aggressive political outsider, intent on strengthening his country and asserting its preeminence in front of other world powers, especially Mexico and Great Britain. Within a year of his inauguration, he had declared full-scale war on Mexico because of squabbles over the Texan border, and was soon rattling his saber at Britain over the ownership of Oregon. To complete the picture, Polk was a vigorous defender of slavery, who dismissed the arguments of abolitionists as naive and sentimental. Polk was a popular president, admired by many for his gung-ho manner, but a sizable minority of the citizenry disliked him intensely. One especially committed opponent was a writer from Massachusetts called Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau is now a canonical American literary figure, studied in every high school for his lyrical masterpiece, Walden. But there is another, more political side to Thoreau, now usually airbrushed out of his story, which came to the fore in relation to the president. Thoreau quickly realized that he was opposed to everything Polk stood for. He hated what became the Mexican-American War, instinctively siding with the losing Mexican side. He was wary of Polk's squabbles with Britain and was appalled by the administration's policy of hunting down and returning runaway slaves to their masters in the South. Thoreau's anger against his president found its impassioned expression in an essay he published in 1849, now known as Civil Disobedience. At the heart of the essay is the question of what an honest citizen should do about a president he or she wholeheartedly opposes. The prevailing view was that because Polk had won a majority, those who were against him should now fall silent. It should, it was often said, be the duty of a good citizen to fold away their objections and just respect the will of the majority. But this was precisely the point Thoreau wished to probe and upturn. He suggested that true patriots were not those who blindly followed their administration. They were those who followed their own consciences, and in particular, the principles of reason. Thoreau wished to redistribute prestige away from blinkered obedience towards independent thought. What marked out a noble citizen of the Republic, a real American, was not, in Thoreau's view, that they respectfully shut up, but that they thought for themselves every day of an administration's life. On the basis of just this kind of independent thinking, Thoreau signaled a radical opposition to Polk's term. He denounced the Mexican-American War, the repatriation of slaves, and the outlook of the government more generally. And so as to underline his opposition, Thoreau held back payment of his taxes. In July 1846, he walked into Concord, Massachusetts to get his shoes repaired and was promptly arrested and thrown into the town's jail. Thoreau saw nothing undignified about spending some time behind bars. As he wrote, "Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is a prison." All machines have their friction, Thoreau admitted, but when injustice is too great, you should let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. Thoreau didn't advocate the non-payment of taxes as a rule, and in fact, a well-meaning aunt soon paid his bill. The non-payment was just one example of the many non-violent ways that a democratically elected government could and should be resisted whenever its actions veer into aggression or unreason. An election may settle who the president might be, but it doesn't determine that everything the president does is right, or that one should simply do nothing until the next election. Above all, Thoreau hated political passivity. Sarcastically he wrote, "There are thousands who are, in opinion, opposed to slavery and to the war, who yet in effect do nothing to put an end to them, who, esteeming themselves children of Washington and Franklin, sit down with their hands in their pockets and say that they know not what to do, and do nothing." This would not be Thoreau's way. How does it become a man to behave towards this American government today? I answer that he cannot without disgrace be associated with it. Thoreau argued that the citizen must never just resign his conscience to the legislation and put himself at the service of some unscrupulous man in power. Thoreau mocked that most legislators, politicians, lawyers, ministers, and office holders are as likely to serve the devil without intending it as God. Thoreau would not be such a servant. this most American of writers knew exactly whom it was right for him to serve, his own mind and conscience.
One of the things that's been important to recognize in the United States was that a professional army is going to transform the nation into a major world power. The American system becomes continental. The oceans become the borders. The U.S. becomes a republic of the ages. There's a nation for everyone to emulate. U.S. historians emphasize that a sense of boundlessness engulfs the nation. With the United States going to war, there seems to be no limits to progress in the arts and sciences and industry and commerce. And the United States is just one of these great nations that's just expanding westward. So manifest destiny encouraged this advance. Through an act of will, anyone who is white and male and adult can achieve equality. God destined that the United States would become a continental system. So the U.S.-Mexico War, again, when deliberated by Americans, is often portrayed as an extension of the debate over slavery versus free labor. U.S. historians seem to ignore the people's experience in the aftermath of war by couching the war in sectional rivalry. And whenever you open up a U.S. history textbook, there's just couple of pages on the war that's couched in the advancement of slavery towards the West. Land, which is the source of wealth, is directly related to the social ideals in America of egalitarianism and equality of opportunity. The human ideal. This is tied to Thomas Jefferson's dream of a nation of small farmers. The human ideal, that's the ideological concept of the American dream that all people seem to have believed in. The human ideal is egalitarianism. The idea that the United States offered its citizens equality of opportunity. But of course, its citizens is racially based. It's white males. Females gain their citizenship through the white male. Now, the way of attaining that vision, that human ideal, the ideal of equality, egalitarianism, that vision is access to land. And in the decades following the 1830s, the dream was characterized by different northern and southern interpretations. There were two versions of the American dream prior to the Civil War. The northern dream was based on the idea that poor families could become rich by moving west. This version of the dream was tied to the free family farm. The southern dream was based on the idea that poor families could become rich by moving west. And the version of this dream was tied to the system of slavery, move west and open plantations. So before the Civil War, the government kept peace among the Euro-American white populations and incoming European immigrants by finding and offering available land. In order to do this, they had to displace and wage war against native peoples and then wage war against Mexicans. And in the process, they had to initiate compromises to northern and southern factions who envisioned different versions of the American dream. Now, prior to the United States war with Mexico, the United States settled questions over slavery and its expansion with the Three-Fifths Compromise of 1787 and with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And with the resulting annexation of Mexico's land, the California Compromise of 1850 led to an ingenious balancing of interests. However, that balance would not last long. It seems that the Jeffersonian ideal of an agrarian life is good for only those living east of the Mississippi River. The movement west for farmers is good until one reaches the plains. Farming drastically changes due to the lack of rainfall and availability of adequate fertile land. Beyond the plains, the United States inherited from Mexico, well, it was prairie lands. It was the Rocky Mountains. It was numerous deserts. The land changed once a farmer reached the plains. And so the cost to farm doubled. By 1860, the only good land available to young couples who could save the initial investment of $500 for acreage and supplies for 1 year was in eastern Kansas, right before the grasslands where the buffalo roam, the plains. In the plains, older crop methods and land clearance that worked along the Mississippi and the eastern part would not work. It took 2 to 3 years to kill off weed roots and then prepare the land for farming. So the time expended by farmers in the West was enormous. In the Plains area, young people had to postpone marriage 6 to 7 years instead of the traditional 2 to 3 years. And they had to save double the investment, which represented the cost of acreage and supplies for 2 to 3 years when the farm finally, if not facing drought, could support the family. So as a result, the westward movement, what is known as the frontier, where you have civility versus savagery, again, a nice concept for those who are advancing and are going to steal land from others. The frontier was no longer a viable outlet for young people who are trying to follow the American dream. So it can be determined that social change is represented in the land hunger of young northern families, in the land hunger of young southern families, provided the impetus for a battle over free labor versus slave labor in the remaining area of fertile land. In the 1850s, geography and economic development led to conflict over slavery's entrance into the West and into Mexican territory. Eastern Kansas became the last area where both versions of the American dream were viable. And it is Eastern Kansas and the events that lead in Eastern Kansas that lead towards the smoking gun, towards the Civil War. Now, the question of what to do with the land that the United States confiscated from Mexico is what led to the Civil War. And that's the consequences, the significance of the war for the United States. Now let's take a look at Mexico's experience and Mexico's responsibility. One side is clearly the aggressor, the other side is the victim. We know who the aggressor is. Mexico loses the war and suffers its consequences. How can one look at Mexico's responsibility in the war? In the United States textbooks, especially from Texas, put the blame of the war on Mexico, squarely on Mexico. That's why it's called the Mexican War. Justifications for writing the war in this way include that, of course, Mexicans, there's a war spirit in the Mexican itself. Mexico is responsible because it didn't sell the land when the United States made an offer to purchase it. Basically, Mexico refused to remediate wrongs against U.S. citizens. Mexico was unjust to the Anglo settlers since the laws didn't give them freedom and the laws discriminated against them, especially when they abolished slavery and forcing them to adopt Catholicism. The local governments were to include Anglos, and to them, Mexicans did not comply. And most importantly, the greatest excuse was that American blood was spilled on American soil. The dispute was over ownership of the land between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, as emphasized before. Mexican historians, on the other hand, take a harsh attitude towards their nation. Factionalism and partisan conflict contributed to Mexico's demise. Liberals blame conservatives and conservatives blame liberals. The major issue amongst the Mexican elite after the war is figuring out who's responsible for losing. Historians look at the liberals as being responsible for events leading to the war, and then they blame conservatives for their ineptness during the war. Mexican historians blame liberals for their policy of colonization that they pursued after the Constitution of 1824 was ratified. The northern territories of Mexico needed development. Therefore, they created a policy of recruiting settlers for the northern states. And this policy of colonization is partly responsible for the war because it was pursued in the most exposed and most vulnerable frontier area. Instead of opening up California and Sonora, liberals opened up Texas. And liberals believed in the government by federalism, but emphasized local democracy, or states' rights over federal rights. And this commitment was good for Mexican nationalists, but it instead gave voice in state governments to foreigners who had no interest in Mexico. Now, Mexican historians, that's blaming the liberals for their policy of colonization that they pursued after the Constitution of 1824 was ratified. Then Mexican historians blamed conservatives, primarily the church, the officer class and the elites for losing the war. During the war years, historians find it hard to locate within their policies any idealism or altruism. Conservatives put their class interests and their institutional interests ahead of their national interests. And this weakened Mexico's negotiating position with the United States. Conservatives put all efforts not to fighting the war, but to ousting liberals from office. Conservatives in Mexico were always willing to bargain with Americans. Americans just waited until conservatives gained power. And once conservatives are in, conniving begins. Historians question the economic motivation of conservatives as they entered into the U.S. war. There was a question of economic gain. Bankers and investors in Mexico welcomed war because the loans to the government provided them with fortunes from the interest on the loans. If payment could not be made, they acquired federal land and property. And to summarize, historians write of the weakness of Mexico's national organization and consciousness. And just by looking at General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna's career, just looking at his career, one can see the precariousness of Mexican nationalism, and perhaps we can get a glimpse of why the Mexican elite continue down this path to this day. Let's take a look at one example of a Mexican elite, which is Santa Anna. He will be president of Mexico several times since the Battle of the Alamo and the loss at Goliad. He was not a national leader. Santa Anna was inept, vain. He had no sense of responsibility. Everything was for his own interests. Santa Anna saw events directly in relation to his own personal fortunes. When the U.S. Army marched on the federal district, DF, they were outnumbered tremendously by all the poor people who lived in the district. However, the poor could not defend themselves since the rich fled town with all the arms, leaving the poor defenseless, because they knew if they did annihilate Winfield Scott's army, they would go after the elite. The Mexican rich in general, and Santa Anna in specific, feared the poor would revolt not just against the occupying army, but also the upper class. Just to share with you the vanity of Santa Anna, in a war where he would lose his leg, he would preserve it in pickle juice and offer it to the National Museum for historical purposes. This is how vain he was. So let's go to a PBS documentary on the war that we have been viewing, and let's witness how the Mexican elite abandoned their country and left the poor defenseless, as they usually do.
With Chapultepec Castle no longer a threat, Scott's troops battled their way up the two western causeways, taking both San Cosme and Belen gates by the end of the day. That night, Santa Anna met with his key commanders and several political leaders to decide the city's fate.
Yo creo que de los momentos más trágicos en la historia.
I think among the most tragic moments in the history of Mexico is that night, September 13th, when the last recourse, the last possibility, or nearly the last possibility,
de la defensa de la
of
ciudad.
defending Mexico City was exhausted.
Y evidentemente para el hombre, para el general,
And evidently for General Santa Anna,
pues es terrible
it's terrible
tener que aceptar
to have to accept
que volvió.
that he's failed again.
A little after 11 o'clock, a carriage came for General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Later in the night, some 9,000 troops followed him out of the city. At 4 o'clock the next morning, September 14th, a delegation of city leaders went to Scott's headquarters and surrendered. Within hours, General Scott's army entered the Plaza de Armas, the heart of the capital, in triumph. Some resistance did come from an unexpected quarter. Santa Anna had emptied the jails, and the prisoners joined thousands of beggars and indigents coursing through the streets. Only a few had weapons. Most could only heave stones at the invaders.
Sad to say, this generous effort by the lower classes was bitterly denounced by the privileged classes, people who could look with indifference on the humiliation of their country if they could only preserve their own interests and comforts. Guillermo Prieto.
Entonces es claro para mucha gente que si
It's very clear to many people that if these lower class people are armed,
derrotan, barren con los 10,000
they will conquer
soldados
Scott's 10,000 soldiers
una revolución
and
global,
continue with a nationwide social revolution.
no lo pueden permitir.
This could not be permitted.
Prefieren perder
They'd rather
lo que
lose
hay
whatever there is to lose against the United States
antes de arriesgar una
than risk a
revolución
social
social
upheaval
que
that could
borre
wipe the
la
privileged classes off the map.
privilegio en México.
As the Americans tightened their grip on the capital, Santa Anna resigned his presidency. Manuel de la Peña y Peña, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, became President of Mexico. Within a month, Peña y Peña ordered Santa Anna court-martialed and stripped of his command. Wanted by his own government and pursued by U.S. soldiers, Santa Anna finally fled to exile in Jamaica. In a farewell message to the country, he defended himself with a familiar blend of self-pity and pride.
Fellow citizens, misfortune has deprived me of the incomparable satisfaction of presenting to you a splendid victory. But never have I committed a crime against my country. A good name, when I am gone, is the height of my ambition. I have wished all that is great and glorious for Mexico, and to obtain it I have not spared even my own blood. This you know, and will do me justice.
Pobrecito Santa Anna. Okay, that ends U.S. war with Mexico part 2.